listening to the Sustainable Angler Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Crawford. In this episode, I interviewed Dr. Peter Barile and Terry Gibson from the American Water Security Project. We talk about how wastewater treatment and sewage is wreaking havoc on the fishery down in Florida and what they're doing to help solve the problem. Hope you enjoy it. This episode of the Sustainable Angler Podcast is brought to you by Emerger Strategies, a sustainable business consultancy that improves the social, environmental, and economic bottom lines of your business. Profit sustainably. All right, thanks for joining me. I've got Peter Barile and Terry Gibson from the American Water Security Project on the call. So thanks, guys, and how's your day going?
Well, we're really excited to be on this call, and thanks for having us. We should be fishing, but this is more important.
That's right. Well, great. Well, I thought I would kick things off on the call. If Peter, you wanted to start with just an introduction of yourself and your background, and then we'll let Terry do the same.
Thank you, Rick. My name is Dr. Peter Barile. I'm a native Floridian. I'm in Melbourne, Florida, and I have a PhD in environmental sciences. I'm a marine and estuarine and coastal ecologist. I also have a background in science policy. I've been involved in land use issues in Florida and how they relate to coastal water quality and fisheries.
Awesome. And Terry, what about you?
Well, I spent the first half of my career in the journalism business, like you, and I worked for magazines such as Surfer Magazine and became the editor of Saltwater Fly Fishing Magazine. And I spent 4 or 5 very happy years with the Florida Sportsman family, and I went on to become the fishing editor of Outdoor Life. But throughout those stints of service, I was always covering and engaging in conservation issues, and specifically water quality, which is how I got to know Dr. Barile. We were young surfers and fishermen that were tired of getting sick and watching really cool things die. And so the second half, and hopefully the rest of my career, has been devoted to conservation initiatives. And I've worked for about the last 10 years as a consultant for just about every major and most minor national, international conservation organizations, especially those that relate to fishing. And so a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to put together the American Water Security Project. And my first call was to my old friend, Peter Barile, who taught me just about everything I know about wastewater and pollution and coastal fisheries.
Well, that's super cool. And I had, we have a mutual friend in Brandon Schuler, who I know is involved with the project, and he had reached out, and what y'all are doing is pretty fascinating, I think, just because it's not something that gets a lot of people know about, I feel like, especially when it comes to wastewater. And I was wondering if one of y'all would just provide a little bit of background on American Water Security Project, what it is that y'all do, and what are, maybe even give a state of Florida coastal water quality and habitats.
Well, I'll give the background. Again, this is Terry. So, and the background begins literally 20 years ago. when I was working at Surfer Magazine, one of the first campaigns I worked on was the Beaches Act, or the Beach Act. And that was, everybody was getting sick all the time, fishermen, surfers, swimmers, from fecal bacteria. And we got federal legislation passed that funds routine water quality monitoring. So if you ever heard of a beach closure, it was probably because of the monitoring through the Beach Act. Mm-hmm. About that time, I met Peter, and a few short years later, Brandon. And in those days, the cruise ships were dumping sewage in Florida waters. We had a growing leaky septic tank crisis, and there were raw sewage being spilled all over the place. And so Peter and I and a few others put together an informal team and took the issues to the Tallahassee legislature and managed to get cruise ships to prevent the cruise ships from any future dumping of raw sewage within state waters. And we also managed to get a date certain set for some sewage outfalls that have killed our Florida reefs. But, in the intervening years, we've worked together, but we've had little or no funding, and we've all been busy doing other things. And we've done this out of a sense of love and self-defense. And a couple of years ago, I work as a part-time hunting guide these days as well. Can't quite ever get guiding out of my system. And a couple of years ago, some longtime clients of mine and friends, I literally was like their bird boy when I was at their dove hunts when I was 8 years old. Older gentlemen, they called me, and they'd been diving down Fort Lauderdale and said, we caught a limit of lobsters around a shit pipe. Can we eat them? And I said, absolutely not, sir. You should bring them directly to me. And they laughed, and they said, yeah, we know what you're going to do. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to eat them. But a couple of days later, they went fishing in the Mosquito Lagoon, which is the northernmost water body associated with the Indian River complex on the east side of Florida. It's about 156 miles long, I think. It runs roughly from Jupiter to New Smyrna. And they went out, and they've been fishing the Mosquito Lagoon since they were little boys in the early 50s. And they saw not a blade of seagrass, and they caught one redfish, and these guys are very good fishermen. And they caught one redfish, and it had about 10 hook holes in its mouth. And they felt like that fish had been caught, a dozen times. I said, what's going on? They hadn't been back to the lagoon in a number of years. He said, what did this? And I said, sewage. It's trashed the ecosystems. It's killed all the habitat, and the fisheries are just plummeting. And so, they'd been donors to other campaigns before, and they offered to put the seed money down for the American Water Security Project, with the provisions that we focus on wastewater and wastewater alone, on a policy level, on a funding and repairs level. And no sooner did we get off the ground, we got a lot of other support from other organizations, and so we've been going great guns now for about a year and a half, 2 years, and Brandon Schuler, Dr. Brandon Schuler, he's a longtime outdoor writer, former director of the Outdoor Writers Association. He was my pick to be our executive director because he's got so much administrative leadership experience, so much experience in water quality areas. And then Magali Fuentes is not with us today, but she's our projects manager. And we had people fighting to be on our board. And so anyway, what we do on a daily basis is work with or against, depending on their attitude, utilities and the municipalities that own them, and try to get them to make the long overdue and badly needed improvements to wastewater infrastructure, whether that's a septic to sewer conversion on a large scale, or increasing the volumetric capacity or treatment levels of their plants so that they can do a better job processing sewage, or going to state and federal appropriators and making sure that there's funds there to make these expensive projects possible. And so over the last couple of years, we've got record funding from the Florida legislature, and we significantly plussed up most of the pots of money that Congress provides the states to improve their wastewater infrastructure. And that's what we'll continue to do.
Awesome. And that was, for me, when I was first getting acquainted with y'all, and looking at your website and all that, it was, I was kind of blown away, the wastewater pollution, alone was having this sort of impact. So I am curious to know, from Peter, what are the state of Florida or Southeast water quality right now? What does it look like?
Well, Rick, I think it's pretty widely known and accepted now, whether you're a fisherman or homeowner, or certainly those of us in the scientific community, that the state of water quality around the southeastern United States on the coast, throughout Florida, whether you're on the coast or you're in inland lakes and rivers, the water quality is on the decline, and it's very poor in most areas. To what we've spoken about already here, we are overpopulating this region. Florida, for example, when my parents moved to Florida decades and decades ago, there were less than 10 million people. There are now 22 million people in the state of Florida, and we're moving rapidly toward 30 million people. And most of us are along the coast. We live on homes near the water. And all of these homes, we produce wastewater. And, Florida had been a very rural state for a long time. We built out a lot of areas on residences with septic tanks in places that were very low. Florida is known for its high levels of rainfall. And this was just a bad prescription in the long term, once we got to high densities and high population, that we were going to have a serious problem with the consequences of wastewater loading to our surface waters and groundwaters. And indeed, this has happened. So we're now realizing that as agriculture becomes less and less prominent, and Florida goes in a transition from being a rural agronomic culture to a more urbanized, suburbanized culture, we're quickly transitioning from agriculture being the leading source of nutrient loading to now urban wastewater becoming the more prominent source, particularly adjacent surface waters. So how is this translated to what we see on the water? And I think fishermen are up in arms as well as anybody about the quality and the state of the water. Many of us grew up in these areas with crystal clear waters, with seagrasses on the bottom, coastal wetlands that were healthy. Inland, we had cypress marshes, beautiful wetlands that bordered many of our lakes. The bottoms of our lakes were sand bottom with tape grass and had a very abundant fisheries. The same for our coastal waters. I grew up along the Indian River Lagoon, which is 40% of the east coast of Florida. When I was younger, I could see top to bottom in the lagoon. We had lush seagrasses everywhere, oyster beds everywhere, hard clam fisheries. It was just a beautiful, great place to grow up and be around and to recreate. And those days are over. So the coastal waters that many of us now know and are accustomed to, the water's murky. The seagrasses are all but gone, and we don't have shell fisheries anymore. So we've seen these cascading impacts and a very strong linkage between population growth, water quality decline, and now a loss of habitat and a loss of fisheries. And now these areas are now characterized largely as dead zones. When you lose the water quality goes so bad, you lose the habitat, all of a sudden there's no oxygen at the bottom, and we can't even grow any benthic macrophytes. Then we're dominated by harmful algal blooms. So we've seen this transition driven by population to where we have lost the beautiful things around Florida and the southeastern United States that have attracted us there in the first place.
Yeah, so you mentioned population, by the way, and that sort of is something that sticks out in my mind. I know that there's a number of issues that sort of, in addition to wastewater, things related to climate change, or also, Florida is now sadly infamous for algal blooms and seagrass and coral reef decline. But at the end of the day, population in terms of just sustainability issues, I think is an important one to discuss a little bit. And that's sort of, what we would call the tragedy of the commons, right? You have so many people extracting from the same resource until it becomes an unsustainable one, I guess, basically. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit in terms of, how is I know we just talked about population, but how that's related to driving algal blooms and what you're seeing in seagrass and coral reef decline.
Of course. Well, to drive this point home, when you develop a large suburban area on a quarter-acre lots, each home with a family in it and a septic tank, and for other examples, when you have a large urban area with a wastewater collection system and a treatment system that is not maintained appropriately, doesn't have the proper investment, it's not unsurprising that we have wastewater, as population booms and we build out in these communities that are in low areas right along the coast, that we're mobilizing a lot of wastewater to the coastal environment. And this is a real problem compared to other sources because wastewater is very rich in the nutrients that fuel algal blooms. For example, wastewater is very high in ammonium, and it's also very high in soluble reactive phosphorus. These are two types of nutrients that largely fuel algal blooms, whether they are phytoplankton blooms, the water getting too green, too brown, or we even have blooms such as epiphytes that grow over healthy seagrasses, or seaweeds, or that preferentially will take up wastewater nutrients and they will overgrow seagrasses. And we've also found in the coastal waters around the state of Florida that seaweeds are preferentially consuming wastewater nutrients, and they are overgrowing and have really been a major driver for the decline of the coral reefs on the Florida Reef Tract, either off the Florida Keys or all the way up to about St. Lucie County. So we've lost a several thousand-year-old coral reef due to wastewater, primarily from algal blooms that are feeding off of wastewater and overgrowing seagrasses inshore and then overgrowing coral reefs offshore. And these are directly related to the human population boom in Florida. And
how does that relate? So is it population? So like one of the things that I have said is that in terms of environmental threats to our fisheries, right? You kind of have just to simplify it, right? I'm sure, or I know it's more complex than this, but just to simplify things, you kind of have what I call the 3 Ps that are environmental threats to fisheries. You have population, you have pollution, which that in the form of whether it's wastewater or greenhouse gas emissions related to climate change or plastic pollution. And then you also have policy, right? And policy can also drive some of this. But I guess when it comes to the problems that y'all are having with wastewater infrastructure and how that's working towards killing off algal blooms and seagrass and coral reef, how does that relate to climate change?
Well, let me first start. Peter, hang on. I want to back up to the policy piece of this just to finish your thought earlier, Rick. So really, it's an issue of what planners call concurrency. In this state, when they think about like roads and development, they think about how many more lanes you need. When they think about schools and more families moving here, more often than not, they've got a plan to add. To add more more seats in the classroom, if not more schools. People have just not thought about wastewater. It's not sexy, it's just flush and done, and you stop thinking about it until your estuary's dead or your lake's bright green. And so, from a policy standpoint and a population standpoint, what we need worse than anything here and everywhere else in the United States is concurrency, especially in the face of climate change, where so many of these septic tanks are going underwater and or these rain events are inundating septic and stormwater systems and causing mass spills. So the magic word here is concurrency, and we're nowhere near that.
Interesting. And so, how does all of this relate to our fisheries, right? So we know that wastewater is causing problems in Florida with algal blooms, seagrass die-off, coral reef decline. We've got population sort of exploding that's causing issues with infrastructure, which is directly related to policy, right? So this is all sort of man-made problems. Well, how does all of that affect the fisheries in Florida?
Rick, let me speak to that fundamentally. And this is what I think everybody needs to realize is that, when we came to places like Florida and the Southeast United States, when the population was lower, our loadings of nutrients to our groundwaters and our surface waters were much lower than they are now. So let's kind of think about this in the concept of nutrition. Nutrients stimulate plant and algal growth, which in some ways can be a good thing. When we grow a garden, we want to put some fertilizer down to make our crops grow quickly and produce good fruits and vegetables. A little bit of nutrients is good. And I use the parallel all the time of eating one candy bar. So if we were going to go for a run, and I'm a runner, it might be a good thing to eat a candy bar. But when you eat 10 candy bars, you're going to get sick. So what has happened to our coastal waters and our fisheries, essentially, is that we've overfed them. So where these pristine environments with low nutrients evolve with very prolific fisheries under these, quote, oligotrophic or low nutrient conditions, when we over-enrich them with too many nutrients, we made them sick, and we caused a severe dysfunction in the food web to where we are not producing the right kind of phytoplankton, the right kind of algae, and the right type of habitat that will support fisheries. In fact, in many cases, we are now feeding toxic algae that clog the gills of filter feeders, such as oysters and clams. So we don't have that secondary production of food base that our finfish need. So all of a sudden, you have created toxic algae, you've killed off the food base, and then subsequently, we're losing our fin fisheries because they neither have the habitat or the right type of food as a consequence of over-enriching these nursery coastal waters. So we have, from the bottom all the way up to our fin fisheries, even our offshore fisheries, we are affecting them with nutrient over-enrichment caused by sewage pollution. So this is the link between population, nutrient pollution, and loss of fisheries, is that we have overfed our coastal waters, and they are now in a state of dysfunction to where we can't even support our historic fisheries because we've lost the habitat and we are losing the food base with toxic algae from our nutrient pollution.
And Rick, I wrote a book about 12, 13 years ago called Sportsman's Best Trout, about the spotted sea trout, Cynosine nebulosa. Spotted sea trout is the most popular recreationally targeted fish in Florida. Certainly it is in Texas. I don't have data on that. I assume it probably is in Louisiana, North Carolina, the Carolinas as well. I mean, you know this as well as we do, Georgia. And, the spotted sea trout is an incredibly fecund, fertile fish. I've read that, at least down here in the warmer zones, that, between about April and October, and I've actually been told this by scientists, that, the big females can generate something like 800,000 eggs every 2 weeks. Wow. And so basically, if you just make sure you don't kill all the big females and you keep the water in the habitats they need, relatively healthy, you're going to have a great sea trout fishery. And, I guided here and ran a small charter service in the Union River Lagoon for a number of years. And I've pretty much given up because of the trout are gone and everything else has declined too. But they're so seagrass and oyster dependent. This incredibly fertile, incredibly popular fish. I mean, I can't imagine what spotted sea trout fishing means to the recreational fishing economy nationwide. It's unfathomable. So now the state, in most of it's just come back with new regulations. Thank God that significantly reduced the take of these fish, but it really wasn't ever a fishing problem. It was a habitat and water quality decline problem, and I just can't believe it in the intervening years of 12 years since I wrote that book that if I wanted to take my 3-year-old out with a bucket of shrimp and a popping cork, I can't catch him a trout. I might catch him a ladyfish or catfish if I'm lucky. And I live where the world record trout came from. So, it's just, this stuff has incredible social and economic repercussions for our community. I mean, it's hit me in the wallet. I mean, I was making 40, 50 grand a year, basically letting 2 young guys run charters on my boat. That income's gone. I mean, and to put it in, to line in the waterways, I started about 10 years ago. We were off, I preferred not to fish with bait. I usually fish with soft plastics or preferably fly tackle if I had guys who could cast. And, we'd be bouncing soft plastics and, clouds or minnows and, bendbacks and stuff, we'd be working it through the grass for trout and redfish and snook and other species. And all of a sudden we started catching this slimy algae on every cast. And then it was this reddish purple seaweed looking stuff that we just, no matter how quote weedless the flyer lure was, we couldn't, you're getting fouled every other cast. Incredibly annoying. And I called Peter. I said, what is this stuff? And he says, it's gracilaria and some other type of seaweed algae, and it's because you're about to lose your entire seagrass meadow. Count down 18 months, gone. It completely smothered it. I mean, it just collapsed. Boom. And it was a long time in coming. I just didn't have the scientific training to understand what I was seeing. But when it went down, it went down. So anyway, I'm sorry about the long-winded example.
No,
it's just really sad.
That's a great example, and that is a direct result of nutrient over enrichment and wastewater pollution. Is that right? I mean,
that's right. And if there's one thing that Peter's explained that I didn't understand, even after about a decade of working with him, we've got to do a better job being scientists talking to fishermen. And I'm not knocking Peter; he does it better than just about anybody I know. But I didn't understand that not all nutrients are created equal, and I don't think most people do. I didn't understand that that wastewater contained a concentration of nutrients and minerals that are particularly biologically available to these harmful algal blooms, that they'll eat it over any other stuff that's in the water from any other sources, and that between its biological availability and the pathogens that the wastewater introduces to the water. I mean, this is just about the most dangerous stuff you could imagine, you never not want to mess with. And we routinely try to ignore the problem.
That's unreal. I mean, to think that something that, as we mentioned, I guess it starts with population, but then to think that it's something as nutrient over enrichment is, I remember growing up, I mean, you just didn't think twice about, I because of this, I'm, being somewhat aware of it, I mean, I don't put fertilizer or anything in my yard, because I live down the street from a creek and I got a drainage ditch behind my house, and I know that that's not good. And I know that, in Charleston, we're seeing our oyster population, we're trying to grow them back by replanting oyster reefs and things like that. But, we're starting to see that decline, and we don't necessarily have the same seagrass, but surely that has a similar effect here than it would in Florida, right? With, we've got a huge population boom happening in Charleston right now. And surely all of that wastewater and even runoff is very nutrient rich, and it sounds like probably too much.
Rick, let me speak to that. NOAA has done an estuarine eutrophication survey, and the Indian River Lagoon here on the east coast of Florida, as well as Charleston Harbor, are two of the most, quote, hypereutrophic estuaries in the southeastern United States, meaning that they're both way enriched with nutrients and are showing and expressing this enrichment by having high levels of chlorophyll and algal blooms. So just like the estuaries of Florida along the coast, Charleston Harbor is also suffering from excess nutrient enrichment and algal blooms. And to your point, these toxic algal blooms in Charleston Harbor and its over-enrichment are leading to demise of your historic oyster reefs, these filter feeders. And as you know, many fisheries such as redfish that depend on oyster reefs for habitat. So not only are you killing the oysters and stuffing them with toxic algae, but you're also reducing a critical habitat for your fisheries there in coastal Carolina.
Yeah. I did not know that, but it anecdotally, we've been able to see that. I mean, there's great red fishing here. I don't want to, downplay it, but when you compare it to, you talk to some guides and things that have been guiding for 10 or 20 years, and I mean, and they'll tell you that, hey, look, this is not the same fishery it used to be, which is scary. I mean, this is sort of the the canary in the coal mine, but it's just it's like you said, it's unsexy. We're talking about nutrient over enrichment, but it's such an important, I think, conversation. I mean, it's because population isn't going to quit growing. So what do we need to do to address it? Is the overarching question. But I want to. I don't know.
Can I ask you there? Yeah. Rick, what do we do to address it? And again, here we get to the policy question, and I am the government affairs guy. I don't have much hair left, but one of the things that makes me pull out my few remaining hairs is when I see people trying to do oyster and bivalve restoration in places where the water is too filthy to ever support them. I can't tell you how much money has been wasted in the Indian River Lagoon, for example, on these feel-good projects where the public will come out and get to put some oysters out and shell out or whatever else and feel good. And these things don't make it to sexual maturity because their feet, as Peter said a minute ago, their gills are clogged by harmful algae. So, what do we do about it? You go address the problem at its source. And that's at, the sewer line, the sewer main, or the sewer plant, or, at the wastewater, at the septic tank. That's where you address the problem. And that's how, and again, it's an issue of concurrency. We can have a lot of people in an area, as long as we manage our nutrients right. And that starts with managing our wastewater properly, responsibly. And unfortunately, the temptation is to expand the tax base and just do it on, cheap, just build now and we'll fix it later. It doesn't work that way.
Right. Yeah. So having a little bit more of a long-term view in terms of what are our impacts.
Yeah.
But I know we was that, Peter, did you want to keep going there? Because I did have another question that I was thinking about.
Well, I think Terry did a good job with making the linkage that we really need to go back to the sources. And the point about population, if in Florida, there was an estimate by the American Society of Civil Engineers that Florida is $18 billion behind in having its wastewater infrastructure functional to the point where it removes nutrients so that our coastal waters and groundwaters are not polluted and have a fighting chance to support habitat and fisheries. We are so far behind. So to Terry's point, if we're talking about the future and what can we do, we've got to have policy that takes care of the sins of the past. The $18 billion in Florida, it has to be spent to get us to the level where we're not polluting on a daily basis. But further, as we grow out and there's no question that we're going to see population growth in the southeastern United States along the coast. It's a given. The question is, how do we develop? And so, we can have high density growth if we have appropriate wastewater infrastructure. So from the planning perspective and moving forward, we must be resolute about having development that is sustainable. And so I think I like the topic of this podcast, Sustainable Angler. We've got to have sustainable communities to support sustainable fisheries. So it all starts up on the land and how we're growing and how we're living and how we're developing our communities. If we want to have good fisheries, we've got to have sustainable wastewater practices on the land.
Yeah, and something that you mentioned there too that is kind of got me thinking. You mentioned earlier, just a little bit earlier, about the NOAA study with Charleston Harbor and we're talking about a lot of these negative consequences of population and development. And I was wondering, are there any success stories that give you hope in terms of restored estuaries if we're able to appropriate this $18 billion and fill that gap? Are there any success stories out there that you could share?
There are, Rick. Here in Florida, in the past decades, in Tampa Bay in the 1980s, literally hundreds of millions of dollars were invested right up front. At that point, it was a very small investment that had huge positive impacts. And that is, They converted the wastewater plants around Tampa Bay to tertiary treatment, which is also known as advanced wastewater treatment, that pulls out 90% of the nutrients from the wastewater. And within a couple years, the nutrient loads into Tampa Bay were cut by 60% as they converted these plants. We saw seagrasses recover in Tampa Bay to levels of the 1950s.
Wow.
The same law, and in fact, it was a local law in West Florida, also mandated for Sarasota Bay that wastewater plants, that the investments were made. Once we saw there was impacts on Sarasota Bay, just like Tampa Bay was severely impacted by algal blooms. When they invested the money right up front, tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars in local cities and counties along these estuaries, again, in Sarasota Bay, there was market recovery of seagrasses back to 1950s levels. There was recovery of scallop fisheries. These are large success stories. However, as population continues to grow in these areas, we still see the impact of non-point source pollution escalating, where we dealt with these serious point sources from wastewater plants. But also further in Sarasota Bay, if you don't continue to invest in wastewater infrastructure and to get water clean to tertiary levels, we still have examples in Sarasota Bay where wastewater that is not fully treated is impacting Sarasota Bay and causing algal blooms and a species called Lingbia. It's a slimy algae overgrowing seagrasses in areas where seagrasses have been recovering. So we have some great examples. The whole world looks at Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay, but also Chesapeake Bay as an example where wastewater pollution was mitigated by large investments in wastewater infrastructure up front, and we've seen recovery in these estuaries. But the take-home message is we have to stay vigilant as we continue to grow to make sure our wastewater infrastructure is adequate so we don't have continued dumping and incidents where we see algal blooms where we've restored seagrasses and fisheries. We don't want to go backwards where we've made these advances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to give a nod to Brandon Schuler, Executive Director, and to Justin Bloom, the Sunshine Coast Waterkeeper, Brandon did a documentary called St. Pete Unfiltered while the Waterkeeper was suing the city of St. Pete and went on to sue the Sarasota County, I believe. The city of St. Pete just absolutely refused to deal with their wastewater issues, and they spent something like $1 billion litigating over a $300 million problem. And Justin taught them a pretty nasty lesson. And then down in Sarasota, they were much more willing to work with folks in terms of improvements. But there are some real bad actors in this arena that really don't want to do anything, just want to grow, and not be concurrent. And it's required some really hard-nosed tactics, namely litigation, to try to protect these places that it's like Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay, that are shining examples for the world about what happens to an estuary when you take care of it. And I'll just add, my father was an attorney, and he was traveling all the time when I was a kid. And usually he would take me with him wherever he had business and intended to get some fishing in on the side. And Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay were places I went back to repeatedly in the late 70s and 80s, and they're a mess. I mean, they look like the Indian River Lagoon now. And our organization is based in St. Petersburg on Tampa Bay. We have a lot of meetings on the decks, flat skiffs, and you wouldn't believe the seagrass. You wouldn't believe the fisheries you have there for even for a place that has millions of people living on it. But again, as Peter pointed out, the investments were made in the 80s to allow to get the nutrients under control. We need to continue to make those investments, and we can still have a thriving fishery and with healthy ecosystems.
Yeah, and something that is interesting too, that I know, which is a natural climate change solution, is that seagrass absorb a ton of CO2. I mean, I know that generally, but that to me is kind of another way of showing how this is interconnected with climate change and wastewater, right? Because if you clean up your wastewater problems that's killing your seagrass, well, then that seagrass comes back, absorb CO2 to solve climate change and enhance your fishery. I mean, am I wrong in making that connection, I guess?
Well, let me say this, Rick. We know that one of the ways to solve excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is to get carbon synced into ecosystems on long term. We know that seagrass systems are long-lived ecosystems, meaning that if you put carbon into plant growth and angiosperm seagrasses, you're going to hold carbon for the long term. However, if they're not there and our nutrients and our carbon go into algal blooms, these are not long-lived carbon sinks. And when they die off rather quickly, when we have eutrophic estuaries and algal blooms, we actually cycle not only a lot of carbon dioxide, but also a lot of methane and hydrogen sulfide into that system and then rapidly out very quickly. So when we have a system that's hypereutrophic from wastewater pollution, we're not storing carbon, we're providing temporary large storages, but then we're releasing a lot of greenhouse gases from eutrophic estuaries back into our atmosphere. It's a serious problem.
That's unreal. I didn't realize that about the algal bloom. So instead of having a long-term carbon sink, they are doing the work of absorbing CO2, but then they're released, relatively quickly, versus storing that over the long term and also enhancing the fishery and as a result.
Right. If we're not moving carbon if the carbon isn't going into seagrasses and healthy food sources, and then it's the fisheries, and it's strictly going to algal blooms that are not being consumed because they're toxic, then we're really not moving carbon into the food chain, up food webs, into places where we want to see production, and that is in fisheries. We don't want to be producing toxic algal blooms. This is not where we want to see our nutrient, our productivity in our coastal waters. So we have seen serious dysfunction in our food webs and our ecosystems, and our primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon, are very much involved in the cascading impacts and the biogeochemical cycling in the coastal zone.
Interesting. So this sort of is a big question. So what is the American Water Security Project doing to help solve this problem? Because it sounds like it needs to be addressed. Sounds like it needed to be addressed 30 years ago. But what are y'all doing to help solve the problem?
Well, you're talking about the climate change impacts, Rick, and we've seen about 10 inches of sea level rise since the early 70s. There's been a study in Miami-Dade County where I can't recall the numbers off the top of my head, but gazillions of septic tanks are underwater during the king tides, or will be very shortly, and a lot more over the long term. So as Peter said, we're increasingly mobilizing wastewater to the coast because of climate impacts. And so that's one of the things that we're talking to legislators about. It's like, look, you've got an $18 billion problem in Florida alone right now. It's going to get a lot more expensive, especially if we keep trying to dig our ways out of a hole by developing on more septic tanks in flood-prone areas. But it may sound like an impossible mission, as many people as there are in Florida and around the southeast U.S. coast. But in the end, this problem of wastewater mismanagement, this absence of water security, is a function of it takes a dollar, the political will, a smart engineer, and some tools. That's what it takes. This isn't Everglades restoration. This isn't something as complex as piecing back together the world's a massive ecosystem in the world's largest wetland restoration project in human history. This is a plumbing problem. That's it. We need to call the plumber. And so what we're doing, the plumbers we're calling are appropriators primarily. We're working with the people on the appropriations committees in the state House and Senate and in Congress. We're working with it was sort of a sort of a tale of two cities type approach. We're working with the municipal leaders that really truly want to fix this problem and achieve water security, and we're browbeating the ones that refuse to do anything about this. And we're bringing this information to the public as a value proposition. Do you want to make a significant investment in wastewater and reap all the benefits of healthy fisheries, water you can actually swim in without getting sick? More water for reuse. I mean, more water for lawns and irrigation for X, Y, and Z, or do you want to swim in polluted waters that have no fish in them, and the next time we have a drought, everybody's going to be killing each other over the last drop of water? So we're working towards what we call water security, and that's that it's clean, it's recycled. It's used optimally, and we're really getting somewhere. I mean, we've doubled the funding the Florida legislature, at least what the governor recommended for this legislature in one cycle, just by raising the awareness of this. And Senator Rubio's done an outstanding job. He's on appropriations on the Senate side. He's plussed up a lot of the buckets of money within the EPA and the Department of Ag to fix these problems nationally, but it's nowhere near enough. And one of the things that it's occurred to us early on as we looked at the size of this problem is there's never going to be enough money from the coffers of Congress or the coffers of the state legislature, or much less local tax bases. And by the way, the United States is $1 trillion in debt. And so how are we going to fix this? And one of the things that we're promoting most ardently on the Hill and on the federal level is a price on carbon that has revenues coming back to fixing our wastewater infrastructure. And a lot of people are really have had that aha moment. Oh my God, we can't afford to pay for this by ourselves, and we're in debt. We need a new source of revenues here. So hey, let's put a tax on something that'll curb our dependence upon greenhouse gases. At the same time, help us adapt in coastal and other areas. I mean, climate change at this point is whether it's your trout stream in Montana or your trout flat in the Indian River Lagoon, it's being affected. It's being affected by CO2, and it's probably being affected by wastewater. So we're looking. In a nutshell, we're finding the funding, creating this political safe space for the politicians to do the right thing, and educating the public so that the political will is there.
No, well, I think it's awesome. The carbon tax too. I mean, we do need to find ways to generate new revenue streams. And to me, the thing about climate change, I think most people misinterpret, that see this as, for whatever reason, for some reason, they're disregarding the science. But for it seems like, this is just too big of a problem to deal with, as opposed to looking at this as, look, this could be the greatest economic opportunity of the 21st century. To reinvent and innovate. And I think that this is what y'all are doing is part of that solution. And I think is really the perfect example of of a problem that starts with population, that generates different forms of pollution, and needs to have the political willpower to get it done. Well, as you said, at our current debt and we can't depend on the coffers and taxpayers to pay for everything. Well, how do we get that done? Well, then we create innovative solutions like a carbon tax, or I'm sure that they'll continue to get more creative. But I love that y'all are solutions based and addressing a problem that, as you said, is if you just wanted to boil it down and simplify it, we're talking about calling a plumber. So, kudos to y'all for providing solutions and what I think is, an inspiring story. Which sort of leads me to my next question is, how can I get involved? How can anyone listen to this? Get involved and support your work to help solve this problem?
Well, Rick, we would love to have you join us. As your business is one of our partner groups. We're building a network of folks we're just calling partners that really reflect Florida's economy. The folks that have joined so far are everybody from beachfront hoteliers to fishing guides to tackle shop owners, dive shop owners, surf shop owners, bike rental places, some conscientious ag guys, some conscientious developers. We wanted to do this in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way, and present ourselves, as first and foremost as watermen, fishermen and surfers and divers, et cetera, that we're on the cutting edge of realizing the scope and seriousness of this problem, and as scientists. But really, as the business face of our future, of our present and our future. I mean, the people that we all absolutely have to have clean water. It cascades through the economy in every single way. And so, we would love for the recreational fishing industry folks. I know many of you to join us and help us send the right signals to Congress and to state legislators and local elected officials.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, and yeah, I'd be happy to participate and have Emerger Strategies be part of your partner program. I think that one of the things, and just so everyone knows listening, if you want to check out the American Water Security Project, they're the website awsproject.org. So that's awsproject.org. And there's a ton of good information. They've got a lot of good resources. And I see that you'll have a take action section as well. So that this is a way that anyone listening that wants to help support the American Water Security Project's mission can certainly do that. And y'all have made it really easy. So I think that's great.
Yeah, just shoot us an email or give us a call. We will find you something for you to do. That's for sure. There's plenty to do.
All right. So before we wrap things up, I do want to talk just a little bit of fishing. And I've got to ask. So Florida being, I go down to the Everglades every year. Me and some friends that I grew up with in Savannah. We go down there every year, happy to support Florida's economy. But we primarily are going for tarpon and love to catch snook and redfish also down in the Everglades. But, we're kind of targeting tarpon. What are, as Floridians, what are some of your favorite species to catch down there?
Well, you just said it for me. There's nothing I'd rather do than chase tarpon with a fly rod. I just love those, and I'm very worried about the tarpon fishery. I can't say that I'm seeing declines in it, but we've got some serious food web issues. One of the things that they absolutely have to eat on their long migrations are pinfish, and you can't really have pinfish without seagrass, and we're losing seagrass just about everywhere. And I'm worried about their juvenile habitats as well. They need these small anoxic creeks, and we're paving them over left and right. But yeah, man, my favorite thing in the world to do is chase tarpon along the beach here on the Treasure Coast, or down in the flats in Florida Bay and on the Keys. And hopefully we'll have a good run again this year.
And what about, so you mentioned chasing them on fly. Do you have a lucky fly that you like to throw at the Silver King?
Up here along the beaches, we've got a lot of thread herring and sardines. So, a lot like the eat me pattern, any of those, the Puglisi bait fish patterns work really well in the clear water, and around the bridges and stuff at night. Our mutual friend Scott Wagner. Well, actually, I keep better not saying this loud. Yeah, never mind. But I've got a woolly-headed black fly that we fish around the dock lights that in the bridge lines. It's either brown, purple, or black, and vibrates a lot. And tarpon seem to be able to find it pretty well. And then, I got lucky enough to catch one of those Palolo worm hatches about a decade ago down in Bahia Honda, and I was fishing with a young man named Gordon. I'm spacing on his last name now, but that was amazing to watch how, just with the ferocity that they struck those flies with. That was cool. I hope to replicate that experience sometime. I haven't been so lucky, but that was wild. But
that's on my bucket list, is to catch the worm hatch.
Yeah,
that'd be pretty epic.
Yeah, but I should add to Rick that it's not all doom and gloom. The trout situation has me in particular bummed out. I've probably caught as many 10-pound plus trout flies in light tackle as anybody, and it was a favorite challenging fishery that's gone. But even like in the Stewart area where I live, around Sebastian Inlet, Fort Pierce Inlet, we're still catching lots of pompano, some reds and snook, and hope springs eternal. We've seen these ecosystems rebound. We just got to get the work done. And in the meantime, measure your expectations. But if you come to Florida, there's plenty to catch.
Oh, absolutely, and that's one of the the things about nature, I think, in general. I mean, it's very resilient if you just give it a chance. And so I think what y'all are doing is one of the solutions to help give it a chance. So my hat is off to all of you. I appreciate very much the work that y'all are doing, and I also appreciate your time today. It was great. This was really educational for me, so I really enjoyed it. I just want to thank you both for your time.
Okay. Thank you so much for having us, Rick.
Thank you, Rick.
Absolutely. Yep. And so just one more time, if you want to support the work of the American Water Security Project, head over to awsproject.org. And hope you'll have a good rest of the day.
Thanks for tuning in to the Sustainable Angler Podcast. For more episodes, we can be found anywhere you listen to podcasts, like iTunes, Google Play Music, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Spotify. Thanks.